Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 136th deck and it's titled Ping for Lethal. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week our random card was given to us by Zach Fornero over on YouTube, and that card is Solphim Mayhem Dominus. Now, Solphim is 2 red for a 5/4 Phyrexian Horror. If a source you control would deal non-combat damage to an opponent, or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals double that damage to that player or permanent instead, and you can pay 1 and 2 Phyrexian red to discard 2 cards and put an indestructible counter on Solphim Mayhem Dominus. So, an unspoken rule of the channel is that if we do get a legendary creature as our random card of the week, or some other card that could be our commander, then of course that card has to be our commander, because how else can we really build around a card if they're legal to be in the command zone and we don't put them in the command zone? So Solphim is going to be our commander this week. That means that we are a mono red deck, and you may be able to get a good sense of what we're doing just by what Solphim says, but just in case you can't, let's take a look at some themes and kind of figure out where we're going. So the first theme that we want to play into a little bit is going to be a theme that I kind of call pingers, even though they don't technically ping. So typically in Magic, when you think of pingers, you think of creatures that tap to do 1 damage to something, but we want to try to focus on the cards like Firebrand Archer, which is 1 and a red for a 2/1 human archer. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Firebrand Archer deals 1 damage to each opponent. So just by playing our game plan, we can make sure that we're casting a bunch of spells, whether they're instant sorceries, enchantments, artifacts, triggering Firebrand Archer and doing 1 damage to each opponent. And then with Solphim in play, that winds up being 2 damage for each thing, which isn't a lot technically, but at the same time, you've got to remember that that doubles up our clock. So if our opponents are at 40 life, and it would take us 40 spells to knock everybody out, now it's only taking 20. And that's a huge increase, especially when we're still able to attack and our opponents are still doing damage to each other. So that is one of our main goals of this deck. Our next major theme is going to be making sure that we can take advantage of small creatures. So there are a lot of different effects that really give us a lot of benefit from having tiny creatures, and one of the best ones is Cavalcade of Calamity. Cavalcade of Calamity is 1 and a red for an enchantment. Whenever a creature you control with power 1 or less attacks, Cavalcade of Calamity deals 1 damage to the player or planeswalker that creature is attacking. Now, we typically still want to be attacking in this deck, even though Solphim doesn't double up our attacking damage, it only doubles up non-combat damage. But Cavalcade of Calamity is non-combat damage. So if we attack with 5 1/1s, that does 5 damage to an opponent, which then becomes 10 with Solphim, plus we still get in the original 5. So instead of doing just the 5 on attacks, we're now doing 15, which is a huge increase from where it would be otherwise. And this isn't the only effect of this sort in the deck, but it is one of the most efficient. So there are other ways to benefit from having tiny creatures, but we really wanted to make sure that we could get in with things like Cavalcade. And then finally, we come to our last theme of the deck, and this one is just straight up burn. We want to do as much damage to our opponents as possible, so that way we can close out the game as quickly as possible. And a good example of that is Flame Rift, which is 1 and a red for a sorcery that simply says Flame Rift deals 4 damage to each player. Now, this does hit us as well, but ideally we've got other things like Firebrand Archer and the Cavalcade and some of our creatures to make sure that our life stays a little bit ahead of our opponents. Plus with Solphim, this just becomes 2 mana to do 8 damage to each opponent, which is a huge swing in our favor because 2 mana for 24 damage is absolutely wild in terms of rate for damage to mana spent. So that is really our main goal of this deck. It is, all intents and purposes, just kind of a burn deck, but we do want to make sure that we're doing things a little bit unique to take advantage of Solphim, and that is where these themes come in. So the next thing we're going to have to do is take a look at some key cards. These are the cards that may be win conditions, but they might also just kind of be value pieces. But these are the cards that are like the MVPs of the deck, the most valuable, cards, I suppose. So the first of these key cards is going to be Zerzoth Chaos Rider. There's not a ton of repeatable token generation in red, and Zerzoth is a great way to generate tiny tokens that can then trigger our cavalcade effects, but also still do other things as well. So Zerzoth is 2 and a red for a 2/3 legendary creature devil. Whenever an opponent draws their first card each turn, if it's not their turn, you create a 1/1 red devil creature token with, when this creature dies, it deals 1 damage to any target. And then, whenever one or more devils you control attack one or more players, you and those players each draw a card, then discard a card at random. Now, obviously, discarding a card at random is not great for us, but because a lot of our cards do very similar things, it's not the end of the world. What it can really do, though, is mess with our opponents because they might want to draw a card, but they might not have things that they want to be discarding, so it can kind of play that role too. Plus, it's generating a 1/1 devil whenever our opponents draw their first card on their turn. Well, I suppose not on their turn, on anyone else's turn. And so that can generate quite a few devils, because if for some reason we on our turn have 3 devils, we attack each opponent, they all draw a card. Now, each of our opponents has drawn a card, we make 3 more devils. Then the same thing can happen on the next player's turn and the next and the next. If everything goes perfectly and someone draws a card every single turn, we make at least 1 devil. But if everybody draws a card every single turn, we're making 12 devils going around the table, and then each of those can trigger Cavalcade of Calamity. Each of them does a damage when they die. So this can get out of hand very, very quickly. Our next key card, before I get too deep into Zerzoth, because he is one of my favorite personal commanders, we gotta talk about Pain Distributor. And Pain Distributor is a card that I only found recently, but has put in a ton of work in some decks that I've been playing it in. It is 2 and a red for a 2/3 Devil Citizen, has Menace. Whenever a player casts their first spell each turn, they create a treasure token, and whenever an artifact an opponent controls is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, Pain Distributor deals 1 damage to that player. So this is a little bit of a group hug style card in the sense that everybody gets treasures whenever they play their first spell each turn, but it only hurts our opponents when those treasures are going to the graveyard. And we're probably not going to be the only player at the table who's giving out treasures. I imagine a lot of other players will be doing the same. So as long as we can kind of punish the table for making a ton of treasures, that becomes very useful. Because taking 1 damage per treasure isn't great, but it's manageable. With Solphim, it becomes 2, and that becomes really difficult for our opponents to combo off with treasures. So if someone plays something like a Dockside and makes 10 treasures, all of a sudden if they want to sacrifice them, that's 10 damage without Solphim or 20 damage with Solphim, and that closes games very, very quickly. Now, leading into our last key card, it's going to look a little different than these first two, but it's going to play very nicely with these first two, because that is City on Fire. For a massive 5 red, 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 it's an enchantment that has Convoke, which is great when we have all these little devils running around. If a source you control would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals triple that damage instead. So all of a sudden, our devils are hitting for 3, our Pain Distributor is hitting for 3, and the nice thing is, if we actually combine this and Solphim, we can choose in which order the replacement effects take place. So Zerzoth could do 1 damage, well, I suppose not Zerzoth, he would do 2 damage, which would be doubled to 4, which would then be tripled to 12. So we have a way to really increase what we're doing very, very quickly. And the 1 damage, doubled to 2, tripled to 6, is the same thing as 1 tripled to 6 and doubled to 6, but you know what I'm saying. It's a lot of math. I'm not great at math. We've established this before. But the main idea here is that this turns every single tiny threat on our board into a massive threat for our opponents, because even our 1/1s are now hitting for 6 damage with City on Fire and Solphim. And of course, there's other doubling effects. There's things like Torbrand that give extra power, but we're really focusing in on the double and the triple effect, because that's going to give us the most bang for our buck, essentially. It's going to give us the most outright damage. And really, if we have a board full of little devils and City on Fire plus Solphim, there's nothing our opponents can do, because they can either not block the devils and take 6 per devil, or they can block the devils and then kill the devils, and then the devils actually just ping everything down for 6. So there is no winning the game at that point, except maybe for us. So those are our key cards, and the next thing we're going to have to do is take a look at some cool interactions in the deck. These are cards that either synergize very well together or in some cases are just cards that I would like to highlight because I think they're kind of fun. So the first of our cool interactions is going to be Chandra's Incinerator and Sulfuric Vortex. Chandra's Incinerator is just an all-star in this deck in general, but I did want to highlight it with some recurring damage. So Chandra's Incinerator is 5 and a red for a 6/6 elemental. It costs X less to cast, where X is the total amount of non-combat damage dealt to your opponents this turn. Trample. Whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, Chandra's Incinerator deals that much damage to target creature or planeswalker that player controls. So if the Incinerator is on the board and we cast a Lightning Bolt, we do 3 damage to our opponent. We then also get to do 3 damage to one of their creatures or planeswalkers. And that can be a great way to make sure our burn is kind of doing double duty. It's taking care of all the creatures, and then it's also going to be taking care of our opponents. So, obviously, we want to combine that with a recurring damage-based effect, like Sulfuric Vortex, because Sulfuric Vortex is 1 red for an enchantment. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, Sulfuric Vortex deals 2 damage to that player. If a player would gain life, that player gains no life instead. This is perfect for our deck, because 1, it's going to stop our opponents from gaining life, and that's going to be incredibly important for us because we can't really race a life gain deck. We want to make sure that we're doing as much damage as possible, and if our opponents are gaining life, we can't really keep up with that. But it's also doing 2 damage every single turn to each player going around the table. And it is important to note it does hit us as well, but Chandra's Incinerator specifically only cares about opponents. So we would take 2, but we wouldn't have to hurt our own creatures. But then our opponents are taking 2 in their upkeep, and the Incinerator is doing 2 damage to any of their creatures. That can really get rid of things like mana dorks or utility creatures or anything that might be important with 2 power or less. But it can also really stack up because if we have damage doubling effects, that 2 becomes 4, City on Fire, it becomes 6, so on and so on, right? So anything like that is going to be incredibly important, and these 2 cards are going to make sure that we have a clean board for us to attack into, but also enough to keep burning out our opponents. And with that one, we got to move into our second cool interaction, which is going to be between Subira Tulzidi Caravaneer and Fire Cat Blitz. So Subira is 2 and a red for a 2/3 legendary creature human shaman. She has haste. Pay 1, another target creature with power 2 or less can't be blocked this turn, and 1 in a red, tap, discard your hand until the end of turn. Whenever a creature you control with power 2 or less deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. Obviously, this is going to be really good with all of our little tokens running around, so the best thing we can do is make a ton of tokens with something like Fire Cat Blitz, which is X red for a sorcery. Put X 1/1 red cat creature tokens with haste into play, remove them from the game at the end of turn, and it also flashes back for red, sacrifice X mountains. We probably won't use the flashback very often, but it is possible that we can just sacrifice all of our mountains to make a huge board that is doubled or tripled and does a ton of damage right away and wins us the game, but it's a very risky play, so you gotta be careful with that one. But what this is really here for is for the second ability on Subira, being able to discard our hand and then draw cards whenever a creature with power 2 or less deals combat damage to a player. If we can Fire Cat Blitz for, say, 5, 6, 7 mana, then all of a sudden we're making 5, 6, 7 cats, which could all draw us a card and just refill our hand immediately. And that's especially great if we don't have any cards in hand, maybe just 1 or 2, stuff we don't really mind throwing away. And then if we need to, we can flash it back to just draw a ton of cards. Granted, we won't have a ton of mountains, but, maybe that's good in the long run, who knows. So I just wanted to highlight this because I think both of these cards are very good in the deck on their own, but they really do make for a good source of just burst card draw almost out of nowhere if our opponents aren't expecting the Fire Cat Blitz. And let's be honest, nobody really expects the Fire Cat Blitz. So those are our cool interactions for this week. And the last thing we've got to do for our actual deck tech is talk a little bit about the price of the deck. And this week, our total deck price came in at $66.46, with our most expensive card being Solphim himself. Now, normally this is the part where I would tell you to, like, hey, you could probably cut the most expensive card if you need to, but obviously this is a Solphim deck, so we can't really do that. So instead, let's talk about our second most expensive card, which is Rampaging Ferocidon. And Rampaging Ferocidon is 2 and a red for a 3/3 dinosaur. Menace, players can't gain life. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield, Rampaging Ferocidon deals 1 damage to that creature's controller. This is kind of a double-edged sword of a card because it doesn't say whenever a creature enters an opponent's control, so it does also hit us, but hopefully with things like Solphim, we're able to double the damage we do to our opponents, but not double it coming to us, so we would take 1, but our opponents would take 2. That is the ideal situation, but there is a chance that this gets out of hand and we actually hurt ourselves more than we would like to, so that is something to be aware of when playing this deck. But if you do need to cut it for budget purposes, that would also be a decent reason to cut it. Maybe you're afraid you're going to make too many tokens and this might just kill you instead of your opponents, so I would completely understand that. On the other hand, if you're looking for a card to put into the deck that I didn't originally include, normally I would talk out of budget upgrades, but this one's technically not an out of budget upgrade because unless it's over $44, it would still fit in our budget. It's just mainly a quality of life upgrade because since I built this deck, Wilds of Eldraine has come out, and in Wilds of Eldraine there is a beautiful card that fits perfectly into what we're doing here, and that is Virtue of Courage. So if you pulled a Virtue of Courage, or you don't mind the massive $2.22, then I would highly recommend putting it into the deck, because it is 3 red for an enchantment. Whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, you may exile that many cards from the top of your library, and you may play those cards this turn. That's obviously what it's in here for. There is also an adventure side, which is Embereth Blaze, 1 and a red, deals 2 damage to any target. That's not great, but it's certainly not the worst it could be, especially because we really want the virtue side of it. Because if we can turn all of our burn into card draw, even if it is just temporary card draw, that can be incredibly powerful. On the other hand, the card that I would recommend taking out for this card is Calibrated Blast. So when I put this in here, I honestly misread it a little bit because, well, let's read it first and I'll explain what I thought I read the first time. Calibrated Blast is 2 and a red for an instant. Reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-land card. Put the revealed cards on the bottom of your library in a random order. When you reveal a non-land card this way, Calibrated Blast deals damage equal to that card's mana value to any target. Then it has flashback for 3 red. So the downside to this card is that it deals that damage to any target. When I first read this, I thought it said each opponent. I don't know why I thought that, but when I put this in here, I thought it would do at least some damage to everybody at the table, and it doesn't. It's only 1, and there is a good chance that we just hit something really small. We do have a lot of very cheap spells in here, so Calibrated Blast isn't going to be the most efficient. There's a chance we spend 3 mana to do 1, maybe 2 damage, and then we flash it back for 5 to again do 1, maybe 2 damage, and that's really not what we want. That's not really efficient. That's not helping us advance our game plan too much. So if you do get the chance to play this deck and you want to increase the power level just a little bit, I would suggest putting in Virtue of Courage and swapping out Calibrated Blast for the exact reasons that I just mentioned. Now, that is our deck tech for this week. We do have to see how the deck performs in a game, but before we get to that, I do want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel and some of the ways you can reach out if you ever have any questions. You can find us over on Twitter at 13POYNZ, Reddit u/POYNZ13, send us an email at dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com, and if you're looking to support the channel, other than, of course, just liking the video and subscribing to the channel, which is amazing, and I appreciate all of that so much, you can also find us on Patreon and right here on YouTube and as our channel members, where you can join the amazing people listed below, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Huey, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, and Paddywhack. And they get some great benefits joining us on Patreon, and as a channel member, they get access to a Discord where we brew up the decks and also play the games. They get access to the deck lists a week early. They get cards sent to them. They get to see everything that's going on and be a very important part of everything that's happening. I've relied on my patrons and channel members quite a bit to kind of catch some of the mistakes I've made in the past. So if that is something you're interested in doing, all of that is in the description of the video. You can find it there. But that is enough random rambling from me, so let's get into this game and see how our deck actually performs. So this week we are joined by 3 opponents, and this game is one that's actually already happened. And we are being joined by SadBerserker playing Itali Primal Conqueror, Aaron playing Ziatora the Incinerator, and Lunchbox playing Gisela the Broken Blade and Bruna the Fading Light. So a little disclaimer, this game did originally happen over on Lunchbox's stream, so if you are interested in games like this, do go check them out. They're awesome. They put on some amazing games. I will make sure to link their Twitch channel in the description for this video, so check them out. But anyway, talking about each of our opponents, we have Sad playing Itali Primal Conqueror, and this is kind of what it looks like. He wants to ramp into Itali as quickly as possible, and then just kind of steal good things from each player, making sure that they can kind of control the board state. And I don't imagine Itali is going to transform in this game. I suppose it's always a possibility, but just in case it does transform, there is a chance that someone just gets infected out of the game with a massive 11/11 trample indestructible infect creature. So definitely very cool on that end. Moving on to Aaron and their Ziatora the Incinerator deck, this is a dragon deck, so they want to be playing as many dragons as possible and just generating some treasures and sacrificing things. And it's been a while since I've played against a Jund Dragons deck, so I'm very excited to see kind of some of the spice that they can bring to this list. And then finally, we have Lunchbox on, of course, Lunchbox's own stream, playing Gisela the Broken Blade and Bruna the Fading Light. Notably, as you may tell from these two creatures, they do not actually have partner, although Lunch is playing them with partner. So we have Bruna, who can get back a creature, and then we have Gisela, who's kind of the beat stick of the pair. But they're really here because even though they don't have partner, they both meld into Brizella, Voice of Nightmares, which is kind of a cool creature to have in the command zone. So even though they're not official partners, this is an angel deck. It was the pre-constructed angel deck that was sold by Wizards of the Coast. It has been modified a little bit, but it's still mostly the pre-con. So if you're interested in that deck, this might be interesting to you as well. But with that out of the way, please let me know in the comments down below who you think out of our opponents might be the most difficult for our deck to take on. Personally, my bet is on Angels because they tend to have lifelink. I mean, even Brizella here is a 9/10 with lifelink, so we'll see how this goes. Of course, I kind of already know how it goes, but, you know, force of habit for saying that. But let me know what you think. Let me know what you think of the deck and the game itself, and I will talk to you all once the game is done. At the start of the game, SadBerserker goes first, followed by Aaron, myself, and then Lunchbox. On Sad's first turn, he plays a forest and casts Worldly Tutor, searching his library for a creature, specifically Dockside Extortionist, putting it on top of his deck. Aaron plays a forest and casts Ignoble Hierarch. I play a Spine Rock Knoll, hiding away a card when it enters the battlefield. Lunch plays a Plains. Sad plays a mountain, then casts Arcane Signet. Aaron plays a Cavern of Souls, naming dragons, so any dragon cast with mana from the cavern is uncounterable. I play an Autonomous Furnace. Lunch plays a Plains and casts Marble Diamond. Sad plays a mountain and casts Impact Tremors, doing 1 damage to each opponent whenever a creature enters under his control. He then also casts Lightning Greaves and then passes. Aaron plays a mountain. I play a mountain and cast Nettle Drone, which can tap to do 1 damage to each opponent and untaps whenever I cast a colorless spell. Lunch plays a Plains, then casts Arcane Signet. Sad plays a forest. Aaron plays a forest, then casts Ganax Astral Hunter, making a treasure token whenever it or another dragon enters under their control. I play a mountain and cast Torbrand Thane of Redfell, letting all my red sources do an extra 2 damage. Lunch plays an Arch of Orazka, then casts Thalia's Lancers, searching their library for a legendary, in this case Giada Font of Hope, putting it into their hand. Sad plays a forest and casts Hellkite Charger, which allows him to pay 7 mana when it attacks to untap all of his creatures and get an additional combat step. This also does 1 damage to each opponent, and he equips it with the Lightning Greaves to give it haste and Shroud. Aaron plays a mountain, then casts Kura the Boundless Sky, making a treasure, and attacks Lunch with Ganax, triggering Exalted from the Ignoble Hierarch, doing 4 total damage. Then, at the end of turn, I activate my Nettle Drone, doing 1 damage to each opponent. On my turn, I play a mountain, then cast my commander Solphim Mayhem Dominus, doubling all non-combat damage that would be dealt by sources I control. Lunch plays a Plains, then cast Vanquisher's Banner, naming Angel so that all their angels get +1/+1, and also drawing a card whenever they cast an angel spell. They then cast Giada, Font of Hope, drawing a card and letting all their other angels enter the battlefield with +1/+1 counters equal to the number of other angels they control. Sad casts Dockside Extortionist, doing 1 damage to each opponent and making a number of treasure tokens equal to the number of artifacts and enchantments his opponents control. In response, Aaron sacrifices their 2 treasures to cast Sheoldred's Edict, making each opponent sacrifice a non-token creature, killing the Hellkite Charger, Thalia's Lancers, and Nettle Drone, but not before I activate it to do 2 damage to each opponent. Unfortunately, Aaron has a response for that too, casting Dismember to give Solphim -5/-5, killing my commander and making Nettle Drone only do 1 damage to each opponent. Then the Dockside's ability resolves and Sad makes 3 treasures. This does give him the mana he needs to cast his commander Atali, Primal Conqueror, exiling cards from the top of each player's library until they hit a non-land card, letting Sad cast them. This lets him cast Grim Bounty, destroying Ganax, making a treasure token, Faithless Looting, drawing 2 cards and discarding 2 cards, Archangel of Thune, putting a +1/+1 counter on all his creatures whenever he gains life, and Faldorn Dreadwolf Herald, letting him make a 2/2 wolf token whenever he casts a spell from exile. Notably, he also has a total of 3 creatures enter the battlefield, so each of Sad's opponents take 3 damage. Then, he also makes 3 wolves with Faldorn and does another 3 damage to each opponent, but unfortunately Faldorn wouldn't have been able to see the other spells on the stack at that point. He then equips Atali with Lightning Greaves, giving him Haste and Shroud, plays a Crag Crown Pathway, and attacks me for 7 with Atali. On Aaron's turn, they cast their commander, Zeotora the Incinerator, letting them sacrifice a creature in their end step, do damage to any target equal to that creature's power, and make 3 treasures. They then immediately move to their end step, sacrificing Kura to do 4 damage to Archangel of Thune, killing it, making 3 treasures, and then also searching their library for 3 lands, in this case 2 swamps and a mountain, putting them to hand. On my turn, I cast Big Score, discarding a card, drawing 2, and making 2 treasures. Lunch plays a Plains and casts Sunblast Angel, destroying all tapped creatures, entering with a +1/+1 counter, and drawing a card. Then at the end of turn, Aaron casts Beast Within, destroying Sad's Impact Tremors and giving him a 3/3 Beast token instead. Sad plays a mountain and recasts his commander Atali, once again triggering the Enter the Battlefield effect and casting Colossal Majesty, enchanting Dockside to give it +20/+20, Old Gnawbone, which lets him make treasure tokens equal to the combat damage his creatures do to his opponents, Jeweled Lotus, and Cemetery Gatekeeper, exiling Kura from Aaron's graveyard and now doing 2 damage to any player that casts a creature spell. This also makes him 4 more wolf tokens, and he equips Atali with Lightning Greaves, giving him Haste and Shroud, then attacks Aaron for 7 with his commander, making 7 treasures when he deals damage thanks to Old Gnawbone. In Sad's second main phase, he casts Sword of Hearth and Home, then moves the Lightning Greaves to Dockside so that he can equip Atali with the sword, giving him +2/+2, protection from green and white, and letting him search his library for a basic land as well as exile target creature he controls, putting them both into play. Once Atali has the sword, Sad re-equips Atali with the Lightning Greaves to, once again, give him Haste and Shroud. On Aaron's turn, they play a mountain, then cast Bootlegger's Stash, letting them tap their lands to make treasure tokens. On my turn, I play a mountain, then cast City on Fire, tripling the damage that would be done by sources I control. On Lunch's turn, they cast their commander, Bruna the Fading Light, drawing a card, taking 2 damage, and returning Archangel of Thune from the graveyard to the battlefield. Then, thanks to Giada, Bruna enters with 3 +1/+1 counters, while the Archangel enters with 2. Then Lunch plays a Plains and casts Smuggler's Share, letting them, in each end step, draw a card for each opponent who drew 2 or more cards this turn, and also make a treasure token for each opponent who had 2 or more lands enter the battlefield under their control this turn. Sad plays a mountain and attacks Aaron for 9 with Atali, Lunch for 21 with Dockside Extortionist, and me for 14 with all of his wolves. Lunch blocks with Thalia's Lancers, killing it, taking no damage. I block one of the wolves with Torbrand, killing the token and only taking 12, while Aaron can't block, taking 9, and then Sad gets to make 21 treasure tokens, search his library for a mountain, putting it into play, and also exiles Dockside, returning it to play, making the Colossal Majesty fall off, but he does make 6 more treasures. On Aaron's turn, they play a swamp, then tap all 7 lands to make 7 treasures. This lets them cast Deadly Dispute, sacrificing a treasure to draw 2 cards and make another treasure. They also cast Big Score, discarding a card, drawing 2, and making 2 more treasures. Then also cast Bala Ged Recovery, returning Ganax from their graveyard to their hand. On my turn, I cast Gutter Snipe, doing 2 damage to each opponent whenever I cast an instant or sorcery spell, taking 2 damage from Cemetery Gatekeeper. On Lunch's turn, they cast Akroma Angel of Wrath, taking 2 damage, drawing a card, and then Akroma enters with 4 +1/+1 counters. Then they play a Myriad Landscape, and attack Sad for 32 with their Board of Angels. Before blocks, though, I cast Electric Revelation, discarding a card, drawing 2 cards, and having Gutter Snipe do 2 damage to each opponent, which is 4 with Torbrand, and then 12 with City on Fire. This knocks Aaron out of the game and removes Gnawbone from the board, meaning Sad can't block, also being knocked out of the game. Lunch, however, does wind up gaining 6 life thanks to Lifelink. On my turn, I play a mountain, then flashback Conflagrate, doing 12 damage to Lunch with Gutter Snipe, and then discarding 5 cards to do 5 more damage to Lunch, which becomes 7 with Torbrand, and then 21 with City on Fire, knocking them out and winning me the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a lot happening at the table from every single player. Sad put in a ton of work with the Atali, and there were so many different Atali triggers throughout the course of that game that I genuinely believed that Sad was going to be the one to walk away with the victory. And it wasn't until the end when I kind of saw that we might have a chance to win, and obviously did have a chance to win. But still very, very cool to see it go off like that. Aaron's deck also did pretty well. They didn't really get to do as much as I think they were hoping. There were a couple of dragons that hit the board very early that got killed. Ziatora having to be on blocking duty, not great, even though Ziatora couldn't really block some things that were coming Aaron's way, so not the best showing, but it was still very cool to see a lot of the dragons come out. Lunchbox's deck also did very well, and I think Lunchbox was able to really get going, and I think that if they hadn't died on the turn that they died, I think that there probably would have been a huge comeback from the Angels, because there was just so much lifelink happening. There was so many +1/+1 counters getting spread around. It really was going to be a nightmare to try to deal with all those Angels. But luckily, through the power of City on Fire and not Solphim, but Torbrand, we were able to pull out a victory, burn down the rest of the table, and it kind of does some work when Gutter Snipe is hitting for 12 damage every single time you cast an instant or sorcery. So a very, very powerful showing from our deck, and honestly, it kind of came out of nowhere. I don't think we would have won the game if Lunchbox hadn't swung into Sad on that final turn, but as Lunch said in the game, we unfortunately kind of used them to get the victory, because without Lunchbox we couldn't have won. So definitely a very fun game, very cool. Got to see some sweet decks, but let me know down in the comments what you thought, if there was anything that you think we should add to our deck, any cards you think that aren't quite worth it. So let me know what you think. I would love to hear all of the different things that you think about our deck. So with all of that being said, I hope you enjoyed the game, hope you enjoyed the deck tech, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.